it's Quinlin. Welcome back to my channel. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Today I'm bringing you guys a June wrap up. It is my favorite month of the year, July, because it is my birthday month, which is really exciting. I read 9 books this month. A little upset I didn't make it to the perfect 10, but it's okay, I'll get over it eventually. I had a lot of fun this month with the books I read. I ended up reading kind of a couple romance novels, which I didn't really realize until I got set up for this video. But without further ado, let's jump into the video. So the first book that I read this month, I actually listened to on audio, and it was The Duchess Deal by Tessa Dare, and it's basically this really silly kind of lighthearted romance novel. It's like, obviously it's an adult romance, and it's just about this like marriage of convenience. So it takes place obviously in, well, not obvious, I don't know how I would say obviously, it's not obvious to you guys, but it takes place in like British society in, I guess, like the 1800s, I would assume. And basically there's this duke who needs an heir and the seamstress who's really poor, and they're like, well, why don't we get married because it will benefit both of us. And so then romance ensues, and it's a lot of fun. And the positive things that I can say about this book was that it really yanks you in. It was super ridiculous and just like fun because instead of trying to be like subtle, it was just very obvious. And there's a lot of romantic tension and just like the whole thing, it was just kind of like silly. It kind of makes you laugh because some of the plot points were just really ridiculous and stuff like that. But I do think that in order to make the book so, like, it yanked me by the collar. Honestly, when I first read it, I was like shook. I was like, oh my gosh, because it really, like, it just jumps straight in. But in order to do that, it does sacrifice kind of like a build-up, because normally I do think in romance novels you usually get a little bit of individual character time where you get to know either the main character or the main two characters and like in their as separate entities, whereas we only really got to know these two as like a unit, and like you learn more about their backstories, but it's not quite the same because I never felt like I really fell in love with either of the characters in The Duchess Deal, whereas I do feel like other romance novels do a really strong job of just like helping you fall in love with the characters individually and then fall in love with their romance. I feel like that's kind of the best romance story, whereas this one, in order to be so kind of like obvious and like ridiculous and fun and everything like that, it sacrificed some of those like important elements of a romance novel where I feel like you get to know the characters individually. And so honestly, it ended up falling a little short for me just because I felt like on the one hand, like, I wasn't in the mood for such like an adult romance novel. On this other hand, I felt like it was just a little too ridiculous for me. And then third, I just felt like there was a lot of kind of like tortured soul element, and I just wasn't really vibing with it. So I would overall probably give it like a 2 out of 5 stars. And it was fun. I would definitely recommend it if you're in the mood for something really stupid, but it's just not my favorite book or definitely not my favorite romance novel. The next book that I read this month, and the first physical book I read this month, was Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And if you don't know what it's about, I mean, fair enough, but it is obviously very famous. It is basically another romance, and it stars like Elizabeth Bennet, and she has 4 sisters and Mr. Darcy, who's very wealthy, and it takes place again in like British high society. So there's like the elements of like power and money and status and all that fun stuff. And honestly, this was such a joy to read. I would read it again in a heartbeat. I never felt like it was a chore to read it, and I'm going to feature this book in another video that I'm filming hopefully later in the month. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but I am just going to say that I absolutely fell in love with it. I did feel like, despite like kind of the old-timey like writing style, I just felt like it honestly just beautified all like the romantic proclamations, whereas like I do think sometimes modern romance novels, they can be a little bit cheesy with like big proclamations of love, whereas like this, it kind of fit because of the time it was in and because everyone is just so dramatic and fun. And like, I don't know what I thought going into this, but it definitely met and exceeded my expectations is all I have to say. And I would give this book 5 out of 5 stars for sure. I loved it so much. It was incredible. I would highly, highly recommend, if you haven't like read it, or you can watch the movie. I watched the Pride and Prejudice with Keira Knightley, which I think is really popular, and I watched Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, which is really fun because I also, like, I love Lily James, but yeah. So I just had so much fun, would highly recommend this book, and yeah. The next book I read this month was Beach Read by Emily Henry, and if you don't know what this book is about, it is about two authors who have writer's block, and they stay, I guess, kind of the summer at these lake houses that are next door to each other, and so obviously there's some sparks fly, and I think you can guess what happens. This book, again, it fell a little short for me, but in all, like, the opposite reasons of Duchess Deal, I think Pride and Prejudice was, like, the perfect romance novel. Duchess Deal was, like, a little bit too ridiculous, a little bit too much of the stupid. It was just, like, a little too much tortured soul, a little bit too much ridiculousness. But this book was, like, a little bit too gritty and too modern and, like, you know what I'm saying? Because what I really wanted is just, like, a lighthearted, fun read. And I guess I had just some misconceptions coming in. Like, I assumed it was going to be lighthearted, and it ended up being a little bit heavier. There were just, like, a lot of deeper issues that both of the characters had to unpack before they could kind of fall in love with each other, or even, like, kind of fall in love with themselves in a way. And when I read the synopsis, I was like, oh, they have writer's block. But the reason they have writer's block are these, like, deeper underlying issues. And so it does make for a little bit of a harder story, and I didn't feel like it was like a little bit darker. Not, like, I wouldn't call this book dark at all, but it was dark for, like, a romance novel. When, like, you think of, like, a fun romance novel, it was a little bit darker than that. I felt like it just I just didn't vibe with it that much. So, to be completely honest, I would probably give this book, like, 2 out of 5 stars. Again, it just didn't, like, sit that well with me. I didn't love it. I enjoyed it. I had fun reading it. I just don't think I would recommend it that much, and I don't think I would read it again. So, yeah, those are kind of my thoughts. The next book that I read this month was The Paris Hours by Alex George, and this book I absolutely loved. It was so good. So it's basically about these 4 strangers, and it takes place over 24 hours in Paris in 1927, and their lives intertwine, and you have to read this book to find out how. So it's just such a fun read. It really transports you. I do think that historical fiction is kind of sneaking up on me as one of my favorite genres, mostly, maybe. I think that, like, in the past I used to kind of hate on historical fiction, but I don't think I read a lot of really good historical fiction. I also feel like I didn't appreciate the actual historical aspect as much, and I just loved, they included a lot of, obviously, history to, like, remind me of kind of what was happening during this era, and it just transports you. It's fun. The characters are just, like, compelling. It's very much like, how are these characters' lives going to intertwine? It's a little bit mysterious. There's kind of, like, a mystery aspect involved. I don't know. It's just, like, it's just super interesting, basically. And I absolutely fell in love with this book. I cannot give it, like, I would give it probably 4.5 out of 5 stars, not quite that 5 out of 5 stars, just because I did feel like the book was holding me a little bit at arm's length. Like, when I read it, I didn't feel fully immersed in the world. I felt like I was... Okay, sorry, my camera battery ran out. I just replaced it. But basically what I was trying to say is that I felt like this book held me a little bit at arm's length. Like, I felt like I was watching the story unfold, like, on a screen, and I wasn't, like, in the story, whereas I do feel like in my favorite books, I feel like I'm in the story with the characters, if that kind of makes sense. And that's the only reason I wouldn't give this 5 out of 5 stars. Other than that, I loved it. I am going to recommend this and probably let my friend borrow this book because I just thought it was such a fun read. And it's not the most, like, lighthearted, fun book, but it did make me hungry for cheese and bread, which I did end up eating after this. So, yeah. The next book I read this month was The Young Elites by Marie Lu, and I'm pretty sure this is a pretty old series. I've had this series forever because I really liked Legend, and so I wanted to pick up her other book, but really I ended up not loving this story. So basically it takes place in this world where there was, like, kind of like a plague, a little maybe too like relevant for right now, but basically there was a plague, and then all of the survivors of the plague got marked, and they're called Malfetos, and then some of the marked people have superpowers, but basically the Malfetos are really mistreated, and so the people with powers are trying to fight back against the oppression of the Malfetos. So that's kind of like an interesting power struggle, I should say. Okay, so I ended up not really loving this book. I guess there were a lot of books that kind of fell flat for me this month, which kind of sucks, but you know, it's just how it is. I forced myself to read this. I was not really looking forward to reading this series, and then I ended up reading it in 48 hours as a challenge, so you can check out my video above. But basically, I was really dreading reading this series. I think I tried to pick it up at one point and I really didn't like it, and then I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna force myself to read it all at once. So that's what I did, and I think it helped me enjoy and immerse myself more in the world, but it didn't make me like the story any better. On the one hand, I was kind of forcing myself to read, so that might have kind of negatively impacted my reading experience, whereas like I wanted to do like other things instead of read, but I was like, oh, I have to read. In comparison, at the same time, I don't know how long it would have taken me to read this series if I had waited, and let myself take as long as I needed. I feel like by pushing myself to read it, it was just over really quickly, and I think I kind of knew from the beginning that I wasn't going to love this series. It ended up being a little bit better than I expected, but I never really fell in love with the characters. It was a little bit of kind of a villain arc, which is interesting, but like just not my favorite type of book to read. I much prefer reading about heroes as to villains, and I think that's just kind of my overall thoughts. The first book was kind of interesting because she was like getting a hold of her powers, but I did get very frustrated. And definitely, if you're interested, my in-depth spoilery thoughts are in the vlog, so if you're really interested in those and you've read this series, definitely check it out. But overall, I would just say that I just didn't have a great time with this book. So then, of course, as you know, the next book I read was The Rose Society, which is the second book in the Young Elite series, and then Midnight Star, which is the third book. And I really like the cover of Midnight Star. I have to point that out. But basically, same thing goes. I kind of enjoyed the ending was both satisfying and unsatisfying. I think I maybe liked the first book a lot because it was like her coming into her powers, but it was more fun when she had more control of her powers. So there's like kind of this and that. But overall, I would just probably give this series, like, I think each individual book, like the first two books I'd probably give like 2 out of 5 stars, and then this one I would give maybe 2.5 or 3 out of 5 stars. Probably 2.5, just because the more I think about it and the more I look back on it, like the more that I'm just glad that I got it over with, because I just didn't love this series. And then the next book that I read was Happy and You Know It by Laura Hankin, and again, this is from Book of the Month, so are Beach Read and Paris Hours. If you're interested in Book of the Month, I'll leave a referral code down below. So if you sign up, I'll get a free book, but it's not like an affiliate program or anything. It's just a referral link. But anyways, I'm not sponsored, I promise. But this book is basically about this daycare group, and then they hire like a musician for their play group. So it's like a bunch of babies, like toddlers, and the moms hire this musician who is kind of struggling. Her name is Claire, to make do, because obviously she dreams of like being like a big time musician, but she got kicked out of her band, and it's just like it's kind of a lot right now for her. She ends up kind of joining this group and then stirring the pot, because she ends up learning about a lot of their secrets and kind of unveiling some of them to the rest of the group. So it's very dramatic and fun. I honestly love this book so much. I would probably give it 4 out of 5 stars. It was just such a fun read. It pulls you in from the beginning. I also didn't force myself to read it in any amount of time, so I feel like that was a little bit part of it. I just read it when I wanted to, but I honestly flew through the book. It was just exciting to kind of like uncover the secrets, and the moms were just like interesting characters to follow. It was interesting kind of like learning about like their insecurities as moms, and then like also seeing them as just like really rich people, but then like each character is very like kind of interesting, especially a lot of our main characters. The main 3 that we follow, I felt like were all very unique, and I really liked learning about them. But all in all, I just really enjoyed this book. I think it's a lot like, I would describe it kind of like Real Housewives of like wherever, and then also kind of like Gossip Girl, kind of like a mix between those. And so if you're kind of into those shows, I would definitely recommend it because it is almost like watching like a reality TV like season unfold in one book. It's just so much fun. Okay, and then the final book that I read this month was The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. And so I have kind of mixed feelings on this book. It's very much like what you would think of when you would picture a classic. When you think of like, oh, a classic, I think Picture of Dorian Gray is kind of it, because it is very much like long-winded. There's these like long explanations about like youth and beauty, and while I found that they were interesting, it was just very much like I feel like nowadays you usually get these messages like in a much more modern format. Like in YA, they can have really deep messages in my opinion, and they kind of cover them in like beautiful prose or just like fun action, and like they usually tell like a fun story, whereas like Dorian Gray was very much like, he was like, oh gosh, what's the word? Was a lot of like introspection, and then, I forgot to summarize it. Basically, it's about this guy, Dorian Gray, and he's very handsome. And when he's quite young, like 16 or 17, his friend paints a portrait of him, and then the portrait begins to age, but he remains looking youthful. And so the portrait kind of displays like his true character, like his soul. And so they talk a lot about that, and it's very much about like youth. Is the youth wasted on the young? Like beauty, how like beauty is fleeting, and just a lot of stuff like that. And then like kind of, it's very much like a corruption arc. So I found that it was interesting. I listened to it on audio, by the way, and I don't know if I would have been able to get through it as fast if I hadn't listened to it on audio, to be honest, because generally I do read faster than I can like listen to the audiobook, but I did just feel like it was a lot of like heavy like stuff, and so I enjoyed it. I would probably give it like 3.5 out of 5 stars. But it just wasn't like, it wasn't like as fun as like Pride and Prejudice was, for example. Like when you think of a classic that's very much like Dorian Gray. Anyways, so that was all the books I read this month. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you have any recommendations, leave them down below. If you read any of the books I read and you would like to discuss them, go ahead and leave a comment down below. I'm just excited. I obviously read all of y'all's comments. And yes, thank you so much, and bye!